Before we begin, I just wanted to thank the people who sponsored the panel tonight. So that's Or Books, Pan American Center, the Cooper Union, and OSI. And I also wanted to thank all the panelists for agreeing to participate, and especially to Lisa, who's a little bit under the weather, but agreed to come anyway. So 2 years ago, a reporter asked President Obama whether he would support an investigation into the Bush administration's torture program. And his response was, I would prefer to look forward. I'd rather look forward than look back. And human rights groups like the ACLU and many others criticized President Obama's response and also the attitude behind it. But I think it's important to acknowledge that President Obama is not alone in wanting to direct his gaze towards the future rather than the past. On Sunday, you may have seen it, the New York Times published a couple of op-eds by former Guantanamo prisoners. One of them is a guy called Lakhdar Boumediene. He's an Algerian national. He was detained at Guantanamo for 7 years without charge, without trial. And in his op-ed, he pleads with us to remember the men, the 171 men who are still at Guantanamo, still imprisoned at Guantanamo. And he asks us to remember the 89 men whom even the government agrees should be released. And he asks us to remember the 46 men whom the government intends to imprison indefinitely without charge or trial. But there's also in his op-ed this passage, and now I'm quoting from his op-ed. When I would not give the interrogators the answers they wanted, they became more and more brutal. I was kept awake for many days straight. I was forced to remain in painful positions for hours at a time. These are things I don't want to write about. I want only to forget. So why shouldn't we forget? Why shouldn't we look to the future rather than the past? The CIA's black sites have been shuttered. The torture memos have been rescinded. The president has disavowed torture. So why is it necessary to examine or to re-examine what we all know to have taken place? And what would it mean, anyway, to re-examine the past in this particular context? Is the re-examination something that we do as a society, or is it something that we do as individuals? And is it a legal process, or is it a social process? Is it a psychological process? And for whose benefit would we be doing it? Is it something that we owe to others, to the victims, or to the soldiers, or to posterity? Or is it something that we owe to ourselves? I want to introduce our four panelists. I'm not going to recite all of their credentials. I think you have programs that have their bios. But briefly, Lisa Magarrell is a program director at the International Center for Transitional Justice, an organization that works around the world to help societies in transition address legacies of massive human rights violations. She's worked in many countries on these issues, but recently she's led ICTJ's work on accountability for torture here in the United States. Dr. Jack Saul is director of Columbia University's International Trauma Studies program. In 1995, he co-founded the Bellevue NYU program for survivors of torture and was its clinical director until 1998. In 1999, he established and still directs Refuge, which is a community-based program for survivors of torture and refugee trauma. Josh Phillips is the author of None of Us Were Like This Before, a book about American soldiers and torture. He's written for the Washington Post, for Newsweek, The Nation, Salon. He's also an award-winning broadcast journalist. And finally, Larry Siems is the director of Pan American Center's Freedom to Write and International Programs. He's also the author of The Torture Report, which has just been published by Or Books. Josh, your book is about one aspect of the human cost of these policies, but it's not the aspect that we usually talk about. Usually, when we think about the human cost of these policies, we're thinking principally of the victims, the people who are actually tortured, and your book is about something quite different. Can you say something about that, about the importance of thinking about those stories?
It becomes even more tragic when one realizes, as Larry pointed out, that torture is ineffective. And it's ineffective for a whole host of reasons. And most military intelligence that one that you speak to, that I've interviewed, that Larry found in the course of plumbing the documents that are accessible via the ACLU, you can see seasoned military intelligence officials critiquing the use of torture on a number of different levels. It's terrible in the interrogation booth, of course, because of the impact torture has on memory and recall. Not very good for gaining intelligence. It's terrible in terms of burning the relationship with public cooperation and a medical force, or a military force, rather. So that is a major source of intelligence. And then there's the blowback effect on the kind of ways that torture antagonizes a local population. And this is not something that we know just anecdotally, but was borne out in meetings at the Senate Armed Services Committee when Alberto Moore testified, and he admitted that through conversations with flag officers, the images of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo had were the #1 and #2 greatest sources of insurgent activity, and therein civilian or military deaths, U.S. military deaths. So, all told, when one considers the full cost of torture on not just the detainees and the soldiers, but on the military operations themselves, you get a full sense of the true tragedy. And part of the reason why I think Larry's book is important, these sorts of forums are important, is because while there is a New York audience that I think would be largely against torture, there's been some polling that's been done that's found that even though the U.S. has trended consistently against torture in terms of the public support of torture, since 2008, there has been a steady climb in approval for torture, and that's worrisome. Not just in the sense of the public discourse, but in the course of interviews that I've done, and most of my sources are military sources, they're very concerned that without firmly reckoning with and disabusing people of the belief that torture is necessary and effective under the right circumstances, with respect to a change in presidency, another terrorist attack, heaven forbid, a different war, we could be revisiting torture all over again.
Josh, what do you trace that to, the fact that the polling numbers have changed?
There has been research done by 2 Reed College professors, and they are basically looking at, they're cumulatively analyzing public polling that's been done. And they haven't published their paper yet. And in fact, I think the research tapered off in 2011, mid-2011. But it was very clear that there was and the reasons why they're finding the rise in torture, I think, are complicated. And I would be remiss to give you a proper full answer. I could give you some degree of summation, but the answer is not entirely clear. I mean, I think the initial response to it was that some of the pro-Bush members who were supporting torture were stoking some latent discontent that Obama had forsaken an aggressive policy towards terror, or seemingly aggressive policy. There are some other things in the mix, but anyway, let me turn to this.
I want to get to Jack and to Lisa, but while we're talking about the human cost, sure. We have a video clip, a short video clip, but Larry, could you just give people some context for the clip? I'm sorry about the mic, but we have to pass the mic around, I guess, in order to get it recorded. So,
we're going to see a clip of an interview with Estela Lebron. Estela Lebron is the mother of Jose Padilla. One of the main stories that I follow in the book is a long chapter that's called A Ponzi Scheme, and it's about the Jose Padilla dirty bomb plot. He was arrested, as we know, and held in military custody without access to an attorney or his family in the brig in Charleston, South Carolina, for this alleged plot to set off a dirty bomb in New York. And it turns out, when you put all the documents together, you look at the charge sheets that were brought against, that were put forward against his alleged co-conspirators in Guantanamo, the story grew out of torture. It grew out of the torture of this guy, Abu Zubaydah, in the CIA black site in Thailand. And it involved, supposedly, Jose Padilla and an English-based eventual Guantanamo detainee named Binyam Mohammed. And allegedly, Binyam and Jose Padilla were going to carry out this bomb plot. But the way that this plot sort of took shape in the consciousness of the US government was this kind of round-robin torture that was happening. Abu Zubaydah in Thailand, Padilla in the brig in South Carolina, and Binyam Mohammed, quite horribly, in a prison in Morocco. And the more that they were tortured, the more fantastical the plot got. And you can see the charges it goes from they were going to set off an apartment, a dirty bomb in New York City, to they were going to set off explosions in apartment buildings, setting off natural gas explosions. And it keeps piling on and piling on. And it really is a story of, it reveals, I think, something about the torture program that's important to know, which is that people are tortured for the same, we tortured people for the same reason that people always tortured people. The idea that we were trying to interrupt plots is a complete fantasy. We tortured people, first of all, because we already tortured people who gave us bad information. And so you end up on this kind of wild goose chase of torturing one person after another. But once you do that, and as soon as you realize that you've got bad information, use torture for something else, and that's to get confessions. And so they were interrogating these guys serially and torturing the guys serially over a 2-year period to get them to testify against each other. And then ultimately to get them, or particularly Binyam Mohammed, who ultimately ends up in Guantanamo, to testify against 25 other Guantanamo detainees who he had never met before. And they're feeding him stories and teaching him what to say about them. So the amazing thing is, of course, we don't hear their voices because they're completely inaccessible to us. We never hear the voices of the people that were tormented. Jose Padilla is an American citizen. He was born in Brooklyn. He was born in Fort Greene. His mother is Puerto Rican American. But we just passed this controversial moment over the signing of the National Defense Authorization Act. And one of the major controversial components of that legislation was whether or not the US can detain Americans indefinitely in military custody without charge or trial. Now, we have in the United States a family that's had the experience of that, but did we ever see her mother, that Jose Padilla's mother, interviewed during that entire discussion? Never once. So I went to Florida last week just to have a conversation with her, and this is a little clip with her.
Jose is a Taliban, he's a dirty bomber, he's an Al-Qaeda. They give him so many names. They present him to the nation as a monster. You don't want to go through what I went through. And I'm still going to. My grandchildren in Puerto Rico, they were calling them here comes the Osama bin Laden family. And it was hard for all of us, for my sons, my daughters, and myself and my husband and the rest of the family. I don't see what they did to him, but I know that people saw it. And I know that the video that the lawyers don't want me to see it, I know there was a lot of bad things in there. That's why they don't let me see it. Who's going to say that my son is going to be the same again after being treated like that all these years? When he's been tortured by his own people, his own soil. This case is so confusing that anybody could notice that this is a fabricated case. I always said that he was Bush puppet. They play with him until the end. To me, it don't even make no sense. I don't care how much the government does to me and my family. They were never gonna return all those suffering to us. They're not gonna make it happy again. In my heart, I'm hurt. It's hurt me to see my son in there. It hurt me for everything they did to him. But what I'm gonna do, I just wait in God. I know that one day it's gonna be, justice is gonna be done on his favor. And they still denying, we're still gonna fight until the day I die.
Jack, you work all the time with people who've gone through experiences like this. And I guess I have two questions for you. So one is, how should we as a society deal with testimonies like this? What should our reaction be to something like that? And then the other is just, are you surprised to hear somebody like Boumediene say something like, "I want only to forget," or is that, is that the opposite? Is that typical?
First of all, I'm glad to see a video of a family member, because I think the story about torture is told so narrowly in our public media that we get a sense that it's just the terrorist, it affects them, and that's it. And the fact is that, there are many family members who are also traumatized by torture, and that this is, a kind of practice that has an impact on people for the rest of their lives, and it affects families and communities, and they suffer tremendously. And I don't think we ever get the big picture in the discussions that have taken place. And when the information about the U.S. torture did come out, you see that the way that the government would deal with the, denying plausible deniability and, focusing on the few bad apples, that this is a part of the torture's toolkit, the ways of narrowing and forgetting. I think it's really part of the practice of torture, forgetting. And we've seen this in many different regimes. They know how they're going to deal with the eventual kind of release of information. So I think it's really important to find ways to bring out into the public discussion what are the impacts of torture. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing this rise of this kind of cruelty these days, and because I don't think that we're really getting a sense of how terrible this practice is. In the quotation from Boumediene, I think really captures some of the ambivalence that survivors have about remembering. In his case, it was really difficult for him to remember his own personal experience of torture. But he did write this op-ed piece in order to bring attention to the fact that there were still people at Guantanamo who are there and are not getting out and who have been tortured, and for us not to forget them. And so I think that this ambivalence about individual memory and collective memory is interesting in how he expresses it. He doesn't want to go back and remember his own personal pain, but in the context of doing something for others, this justifies really keeping the collective memory alive about the torture. And the collective memory is so important for many torture survivors. In fact, for many of the people that I've worked with over the years, it was not the psychotherapy in the clinic that was what they wanted. They wanted public acknowledgement for what they had gone through. And we began to actually look for ways of creating spaces where survivors could get that public acknowledgement from the larger community. And that actually is very much a healing process for survivors, and helps to start to repair some of the ruptures that take place in the survivor's social context. Torture isn't about just destroying individuals, it destroys the social fabric of families and communities. And the way in which that kind of collective trauma is repaired is by creating possibilities for truth to come out and accountability. I think it's one of the reasons why this conversation is so important to take place.
The sad thing is that I think one of the places where you often have these conversations is in court. That often people have an opportunity to tell their stories in some formal legal process. And one of the things that's happened over the last decade is that the courts have essentially closed their doors to the victims of these policies. And over again, victims come into court saying, "I just want my day. I just want to be heard. I want my story told." And the response of the judicial system is, these cases involve state secrets. They involve information too sensitive to disclose, and therefore cases too sensitive to litigate. And that's happened over and over again. Some of the lawyers who litigate those cases are here. Courts aren't the only place where these stories can be told, but I think often they're one of the places. So, Lisa, you've worked on these issues in many countries, and I'm just curious to know what you think we can learn from the experiences of those countries.
Yeah, I think everything that we're talking about here tonight is a story told in different details, but in many different places where there has been torture, and the arguments why it's important and urgent and necessary to take this step, why people should turn a blind eye to the people they've elected or the people who govern becoming torturers, in fact, which is probably the clearest outcome of any torture, is not only that the person is tortured, but that you've created a torturer there. And I think that the experience tells us, one, that no matter how intense the desire to turn the page, and believe me, this is not something the U.S. has the patent on. This is, really the story that we see all the time. Is no, we're undergoing a change now. We've said goodbye to these policies. Let's just move on. We have other more important things to deal with. A country to rebuild, South Africa. Let's get on with the economy in Chile. So these are the same reactions. But what we see time and time again is that it doesn't go away. And it can be for many, many reasons, because victims continue to bring forth the story until there is a measure of justice. And we hear that from Mrs. Padilla. It can be because of voices of people like those gathered in this auditorium, or the work of the ACLU or PEN, writers who take up this story and start to dig into the information. So all of the kind of information that comes out is a hedge against sort of the ability to deny and say, well, we're ready to turn the page because this is all over, or we've dealt with it, when in fact we may not know the dimension of what has happened. We may not really understand the extent to which we've become complicit in crimes that are condemned around the world. So I think that some of the lessons from experiences, obviously the facts change and numbers are different. We were talking backstage a little bit about in Chile, they just, within the last decade, finally had to really face the fact that although they had looked at deaths in detention and disappearances closer around the time of the change towards democracy there, they had not dealt with torture. It was too sensitive. Public opinion just couldn't bear this. And when you look at the numbers, you can tell why. Because although the numbers of people disappeared and killed was probably under 20,000, still a huge number, they interviewed 35,000 people who claimed to have been tortured or politically imprisoned at the hands of the Chilean government. That is a large pill of serious abuse to swallow. And I think that required a lot of work on the part of people pushing for justice, for information, for a new generation to understand what had been so socially divisive. These are the kinds of things I think we see.
Was there a specific inflection point? Was there a specific a turning point at which it suddenly became possible to have this kind of examination of the past? Or was it something that just happened gradually over time? And I'm especially curious about Chile because we have the same issue here where public opinion is apparently not just divided, but maybe going the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether Chile in particular has lessons for us.
Yeah, I think it does, and many other places. I mean, if you look at in Chile, just to be specific to that case, I think the sort of hypocrisy of only dealing with a certain slice of what had happened is part of it, but also it is distance in time. It is the pressure of existing, the harm exists in Chilean citizens. And, I think that's a difference that we have to deal with here, that it's not maybe present in people's lives in the United States the way it is so much in some of the countries that have had to deal with this as an internal problem. But I think that, what one hopes is that you don't have to wait 2 decades. In Spain, we look at grandchildren now pushing to understand what happened, back at the time of the Civil War and during the Franco regime. And there had been sort of a pact of silence. And now it's the grandchildren that say, actually, we really want to understand this. We want to know. And there are things that even when you say, well, we've uncovered all this information, we know what happened. I think one of the lessons we take from the work that truth commissions have done around the world and other examinations of these kinds of massive abuses is that there are things that we don't take in fully. So for example, in South Africa, the story was, well, it was a few bad apples in the security forces that really, caused the problem. But when you interview thousands and thousands of people who were tortured in police cells in South Africa, it clearly discloses the system at work. And I think that's some of what Larry's been, uncovering through this documentation the ACLU has produced. I think in Peru, where thousands and thousands of people were killed or disappeared, many people were tortured, and this was a case where there were acts of terrorism in Peru. But the realization of the extent of those abuses and how society had turned its back and just refused to acknowledge what was happening to, thousands and thousands of people. You learn through pulling it all together and saying, we really have to look at this. Mm-hmm. And there will always be people who will defend what happened.
This question of the victims being either from our community or not from our community, people sometimes say that is part of the reason why we here have been unable to get any traction on a re-examination of the last decade. But I think part of the point of Josh's work is that the human cost isn't just outside. It is here. And maybe as the troops come home from Iraq and Afghanistan, it'll be more and more obvious that it's here.
Yeah.
One hopes. I mean, we were discussing some of this in the green room as well, and my book has been out for a year and a half plus now, I think, and I have had some instances of veterans, now veterans, who are comfortable enough to discuss their experiences, and some have been prompted through reading my book or hearing other work that I've done. And I think, there's a lot of difficulty with coming forward and talking about your involvement in abusing and torturing detainees, but and part of the problem is the fear of, legitimate fear of repercussions. There's actually a Department of Defense directive that was created in 2006 that instructs all military medical personnel to report all instances of detainee abuse that they learn about. So it's a major disincentive. But I think when other troops are reckoning with their trauma, which is not just being involved in a firefight, but perpetrating some kind of abusive violence, that I think may help them collectively to acknowledge their involvement in things like detainee abuse. And by the way, I should say, well, two things. The surprising thing about the reaction to the work that I've done is that I found actually that it's actually been members of the military and veterans community that have been the most supportive. More so, in fact, than the human rights community, which is very strange in some ways. The other thing is that with respect to the kinds of responses, there are, troops who are willing to talk about this stuff, but are re-traumatized by it, of course. And this is not something that's new. In fact, what struck me in the course of the research I did was, and this is something I turned up almost accidentally, there's the largest longitudinal study of veterans, U.S. veterans, is the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study. And one of the things that they found was it was actually not the soldiers' experience with or exposure to combat that was the highest source of post-traumatic stress, but it was actually their involvement in or exposure to abusive violence, which includes, but is not exclusive to, detainee abuse and torture. So, obviously, one of the defining hallmarks of the War on Terror was detainee abuse and torture. One of the things that the Department of Defense turned up was that in 2006, they announced that the U.S. has processed 842 cases of detainee abuse and torture, just investigatively. That's from 2006. There's a lot more evidence to show that it was far more pervasive. So, if that's true, if there was much more detainee abuse and torture than we're publicly aware of, and we know that troops were haunted by this experience, yes. It may be one way in which the sort of blowback, aftermath of our involvement with torture percolates up.
I just want to go back to the idea that the sort of us and them thing, that these are our neighbors or not our neighbors. I mean, I do think it's a factor that shouldn't be discounted. I really think that there has been a very calculated, Estella used the word, they made him a monster. There's been a monsterization of supposed Al-Qaeda, terrorist members. And, Jose Padilla is now being held in a supermax prison in Colorado. The debate is whether or not these facilities are capable of holding these people. The supermax prison in Colorado, as I understand it, is almost entirely underground. As if these are some kind of supermen that can, transport themselves through conventional prison walls.
Chew through cables on a C-130 was the phrase.
Yeah, exactly. But the interesting thing is, again, as far as how this process works, we never hear their voices. The ACLU did some recordings of 4 of the detainees who were based in Britain who were returned home, and they did these videos, and we showed them as part of this Reckoning with Torture program we do. And there's an amazing moment where one of them is describing his being subjected to the temperature manipulation, extreme cold temperatures. And he says, I used to work at Burger King, and it was like walking into the refrigerator at Burger King. We don't even think that we have common cultural references with these people. There's a moment where this guy, Mohamedou Ould Slahi, his attorney asks him to write down all of the abuse that he had been subjected to. And he writes back, he says, you asked me to write down everything I told my interrogators. Are you out of your mind? How can I render uninterrupted interrogation that has been lasting the last 7 years? That's like asking Charlie Sheen how many women he dated. You know, and then there was another great moment where this guy, Binyam Mohammed, is having his combatant status review hearing, and he decides, you know, he asks to show up. He asks his attorneys to bring him orange-dyed clothing, you know, because they wanted not to appear in the jumpsuit, but he dresses up, and he writes on a sign, "Con mission," not commission. It's the, you know, and halfway through, he holds up his sign, and he says, "This isn't a commission, this is a con mission." You know, and he gives this long speech. And, you know, the only access we have to the detainees telling their own stories are the transcripts of these hearings that they had in Guantanamo. And some of them are quite amusing. Some of them are, there's a level of personal outrage in some of them. There's a level of total confusion. You know, but in all of them, their voices or characters, you know, you instantly recognize personality types. And, you know, and there, in none of them do the people appear monstrous, I have to say. And so I think, you know, if these were our neighbors, if their families were our neighbors, you know, that extreme level of vilification could not have happened.
You know, the exclusion of these voices, I think, has been, in large part, by design. You know, we have tried to get prisoners, former Guantanamo prisoners, admitted to the United States to speak in the United States. They've always been denied visas. The op-eds in the New York Times this weekend, I think, were remarkable in part because they were so rare. It's so rare to see a former prisoner being given that kind of platform. But I also wonder whether the way the debate played out in the United States is also sort of partly responsible for what happened here, because there was a time when there were voices in favor of torture, and then the voices on the other side were saying, this is a bad idea, but they weren't saying this is a bad idea because it's immoral or because these people are human or because, you know, what they were saying is it's a bad idea because it doesn't reflect our values. It's not about them, it's about us. In fact, that phrase, it's not about them, it's about us, is a phrase that was used over and over in the congressional debates. And I think it was a phrase, to be fair, that was also used by the human rights community at various points. And that's a phrase that I think, at the very least, marginalizes the victims' voices and maybe sort of, you know, makes them disappear altogether.
I mean, I think that's true, but I think one of the most chilling things that I found was, you know, very early on in the CIA, there's this discussion about endgame. That's the word they keep using, and endgame is, what do you do with somebody that you've tortured? They recognize immediately that they've got this problem, you know. And there's a phrase in one of the Inspector General's report where he talks about, you know, that where there's an agency interest in essentially in making sure that this person is not able to tell his story. And there's been a certain level of the ongoing indefinite detention of a certain number of people that's specifically in order that they not be able to tell their story. And you look at some of the major people whose cases that everybody has heard about, Abu Zubaydah, he's still in Guantanamo. His name never shows up on the list of people who will be tried either on in a military commission or in a civilian court. Mohammed al-Kantani is another person. These are the people who you know, Bush administration officials and Obama administration officials have publicly acknowledged now were tortured, and yet we have not released them. And I think you know, that part of the reason that we have, I think exclusively in some cases, the reason we haven't released them is because they'll tell their stories. And I think, you know, it's that there is something about, you know, again, back to the question of why should we do this? I mean, I think there's something really horribly degrading about that for all of us, I think, to think of the level of conspiracy that's involved there. If we don't do this, if we don't account for these things, we essentially consent to be lied to, you know, and that's, I find that personally degrading, you know, to listen to people lying to me, you know, over and over again. You know, Bush, when he published his book last year, he told an audience in Miami that, you know, he proudly says that he ordered the waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And he says, you know, and I walk you through in the book how we got congressional approval for these enhanced interrogation techniques. Congress never approved enhanced interrogation techniques. That is simply a lie. And then when Jay Bybee...
a standing ovation, right?
He got a standing ovation for that. And then Jay Bybee, one of the lawyers who wrote the torture memos, The Office of Professional Responsibility, this investigation of the lawyers, whether they had acted unethically in writing these memos that justified torture. And in his defense to the draft report, he alludes to the ticking time bomb scenario. He says, look, this was the pressure we were under. There was a ticking time bomb. And he specifically says there was a ticking time bomb, that Jose Padilla had planted a dirty bomb in New York. He says this in his letter in the report. Now, even at the time, the day that Jose Padilla, they announced that they had transferred him to military custody, they never said he had planted a bomb. They said he had an idea to plant a bomb. And the next day, they had to come out and tell the press. Wolfowitz famously said, well, it was no more than just some loose talk, is what he said. But now, several years later, Bybee is who's a federal judge, is saying, a federal judge is saying, on his, response to the Office of Professional Responsibility, we did this because there was a dirty bomb planted. I think, I think, to sit there as a country and let people say these things to us is to, to acquiesce to what was really essentially a very serious conspiracy to torture people.
I just want to add a couple of things. I mean, it is astounding, and I think, if I'm recalling correctly, you who know the facts better will correct me, but even in the investigations that were done internally, at least the redacted versions that we've seen, they really don't look at the testimony of the people who were tortured. It's really everything but. So you think about the quality of the investigations, that kind of thing, and the kind of investigations that you said had been done, the quality, where they looked, how far up the chain of command. These are all issues that I think we've seen through the documentation. But I wanted to come back to the point that Jameel raised about the lawsuits and, where is the space for hearing that voice, particularly with the distance and the sort of inaccessibility directly to people. And I just wanted to say that I think even though the stream of legal actions has been so dismal in terms of actual results and recognition of rights, that these are important records. And, when I was looking through for, well, where can I, read about beyond some of the human rights reports and other investigations that have been done by civil society, looking at the legal complaints. These are sworn, statements about what has happened. And in many other countries, this has been the case as well. In many places where courts didn't function, but people were being held in detention, people just routinely filed habeas corpus petitions. And that was the way to document what had happened to that person. There was a story about, this person was taken away by men in a car with darkened windows at this time of night. This is the style of which we know that the death squads operate, or whatever it happens to be. And these records of hundreds and hundreds of habeas that are never resolved by the courts, which is, the action to determine where someone's being detained and what their status is, they become a record and later can also be a way to come back to the information that was available at the time. So I think, these are the kinds of things that as we make sometimes fruitless efforts towards a legal end, we make headway on other grounds. And I think, all of the work that's being done to bring out this information and to make it available, what it does, we hope, is tend to lead to more questions and not to say, oh, now we know, because obviously we don't.
One of the reasons why we file lawsuits at the ACLU is to tell the story not just to the court, to the public generally. Jack, I wanted to ask you a question that you can't possibly hope to answer in the time we have available to us. But I work at a legal organization, and we talk all the time about how a society ought to deal with events of the kind that we have collectively experienced over the last decade. But we don't often talk about, or ever talk about, how individuals recover from these kinds of experiences. I wonder if you feel like that question gets enough space in this conversation. Is it enough for us to be talking about accountability processes and court hearings, or is there a conversation that we're not having about how individuals themselves recover?
I don't think we hear enough about the stories of the impact on individuals in their lives that goes on for years. I don't see it. I don't see many testimonies about that in the media.
And you think those testimonies help not just us, but they help the people who experience these things. They help the victims of these policies.
That's been my experience. That one of the things that I think for many survivors who really, some people who've been tortured or really have been so destroyed, they're kind of barely surviving. I think even in Chile, I was down in Santiago recently, and even with the public acknowledgement there, where you did have many survivors come out and kind of document that they had been tortured, still there were thousands of survivors there that wouldn't come forward even to put their name, even under the current circumstances. And so, I mean, there are people who really just don't recover. And but I think it's a combination of kind of individual help, but it's also a social process. I think the social ecology in which torture or in which these issues are dealt with later is an important aspect of people's recovery. When you live in a society that denies of an experience that you've had and you can't talk about it, that's a trauma after the trauma. I mean, I think many survivors feel that that's even more traumatic than the original torture.
Right. Well,
It's like their reality doesn't exist in the collective reality.
You said earlier that the forgetting is an extension of the torture, and that is something I hadn't thought of before.
And I was wondering about just our avoidance and the kind of politically what Obama's doing. We can talk about how it kind of implicitly condones the torture by not having any kind of real, substantial investigation or accountability for the torture. But in fact, it's a continuation of the abuse for the survivors to not engage in these processes.
Yeah, it essentially continues the denial of humanity. Mm-hmm. And it also is a failure of a legal obligation, because under the Torture Convention, states that have tortured have to not only investigate, hold accountable those responsible, and particularly those most responsible for designing illegal policies such as torture, condoning it when it happens, but also to take steps to try to make some redress to victims. And part of that can be the acknowledgement of what happened. And I do think that the denial of the truth is a way to continue sort of the same message that the torture had, but also to put victims back on their feet. And I think that that's something that's universally needed. And I think that in cases where there's been demonization across the board, and there may be people who really need this kind of support, but the U.S. political climate is so hostile to the notion, even of allowing people to set foot, outside of Guantanamo onto U.S. soil, that it's a very difficult argument to take up, but
the amazing
eventually...
thing is that other countries that were relatively marginally involved in the torture program have compensated the victims of torture. So, for example, Magarrell, who's a Canadian citizen who was rendered to Syria, the involvement of the Canadians was relatively tangential. But they had a judicial inquiry in Canada, $10 million of compensation to Arar, and the United States, which by contrast was principally responsible for his torture at the hands of, or certainly principally next to the Syrians, responsible for his torture at the hands of the Syrians, has not even acknowledged that he was a victim. And that's true of many of the people who were victims of the rendition program, where there were multiple countries that participated in the abuse. The other countries are increasingly acknowledging their role and compensating the prisoners, but so far we haven't seen anything like that here.
Yeah, I do think it's another pressure that will continue to come to bear on the United States to face up to what it's done, and that it is that central player, and it's good name, good standing with countries in Europe, and it's not only about in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, but that these are countries that are going to put pressure indirectly on the United States in some way, and so we will continue to see those kinds of issues arise.
So I want to save some time for questions and comments, but I'll ask just one last question of Larry and maybe Josh too. This idea of forgetting as an extension of the torture, I mean, it maybe suggests that writers have a special role to play in addressing the legacy of torture. I wonder whether that's something you've thought about, whether you're willing to bear that particular burden.
Well, it's certainly something that we've thought about at Penn. I mean, I think Penn is an international human rights organization that has had part of our international advocacy for a long time, protesting torture internationally. And of course, like all human rights organizations, we found our work infinitely more complicated after 9/11, when we were trying to complain about the torture of a writer in some country, and countries would literally answer us by saying, what, you can't really say that anymore to us. So that became something that it directly impacted our advocacy work. But at the same time, many of Penn's most one of Penn's proudest members are people like Václav Havel and people who have been part of these processes, Nadine Gordimer in South Africa, and people in other countries whose work is, a lot of their work has been about, how do you address these things? Ariel Dorfman, another example. The role that writers have played in these countries in telling these stories and excavating the truth, and in really looking at them, I think, in the way that we're trying to talk tonight on a human level. These are extremely intimate human exchanges, torture. It's really, that was sort of Ariel Dorfman's great point. There's a kind of intense human intimacy to torture. And I think writers have probed that. They've, and that's where the real damage is done. That's where the real heroism happens. These are not all dark stories. I think for me, the sustaining thing of doing this whole project was, this was not a nightmare for me. This was not a grueling 2-year process. This was a process of constantly finding affirmation, in the documents of heroic interventions, of principled people, voices that represented the values that I understand our country to represent. And I think it's, so when you tell these stories, it's not just the dark side. It's also the conflicts, the ambivalence that individual characters have about it, the torment that, the position that we put people in and having to decide whether or not they were going to do that. All of those are fascinating for a writer. Those are the engines of good narrative. So it's not only that there's something important to do, but it's also really good red meat for writers in a way. But I think it is an essential part of the process.
I'm glad to hear that there's a writer among us who has had a positive experience. Let's see. There's a few things floating through my brain right now, and one of the things that I wanted to sort of loop back to in a way, a la the discussion of accounting for what's documented and whatnot, and being sort of a part of marshaling through those stories and highlighting them. There's a lot that's not documented that relates to sort of what we're talking about in terms of the acknowledgement of people's pain. I worked on a story that was sort of an extension of what I covered in the book, and a small section of what I covered in the book, with respect to the investigations that were done into detainee abuse. And the people that I spoke to not only included victims and whistleblowers, but were also the military investigators. And by their own account, their position is that and these are the people who, mind you, are not just run-of-the-mill investigators. They were the people who were directly charged with investigating all non-Abu Ghraib detainee abuse in Iraq during the peak of the investigative era for detainee abuse in Iraq. And by their own account, there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of detainee abuse and torture that we're simply not even aware of, for a whole host of reasons, and it's complicated to unspool that exactly. The other thing is that I spent quite a long time in the Middle East and Afghanistan interviewing former torture victims, and one of the things that was very difficult about their experience, of course, not just wasn't just the abuse itself. The nature of it was horrible in many circumstances, i.e. sexual, involving sexual debasement and whatnot, something nobody really wants to talk about. But a component of the abuse that they experienced was that very often the techniques that U.S. forces employed didn't leave marks. Now, why is that important? Two reasons. Number one, forensically, it's very hard to investigate these cases, and so there is no accountability for those cases. You mentioned that it's hard to get victims to talk. Well, I mean, that's another reason why so many cases had fallen through. Military investigators, by their own account, didn't reach out and investigate people, and so we don't know about those victims. I mean, they're invisible in every sense, investigatively, experientially, and so forth. And the other thing is, reason number two why stealthy techniques are important in the detainees' traumatic experiences, it's another way of denying or invalidating the trauma that they've been through. And so it lives on for them.
I wish, because I've heard many of these conversations, that we would commit more of our energies to figuring out how to take the conversation beyond the choir. Last night on C-SPAN, there was an extensive discussion about Guantanamo with Tom Wilner, who had brought the case in the Supreme Court about Hamdi. And yet, again, it's a very small group that's really hearing. We know, that amongst the Republican candidates, the only ones who were against waterboarding were Ron Paul and John Huntsman. See how far that'll get you. But perhaps if there's an Obama win and he's a little bit freer, there's the possibility of getting him to carry this issue publicly, which is where it needs to be carried, or there are ways to work through the education system. On the other side, I just don't know. I mean, it's complete puzzlement, but thank you.
I mean, this is something that the ACLU, I know Penn too, struggle with all the time, trying to engage a broader audience. And I wonder, Larry, if you might talk just a little bit about the Reckoning with Torture project.
Avram, you want to talk about it?
Oh, Avram, yeah, you can talk about it.
This is Avram Ludvik. He works with the filmmaker Doug Lyman, and Penn and the ACLU and Avram and Doug have been working on a film project that is, we hope, helping to carry this beyond this film.
Well, I thought we heard a beat of the trailer when I came in, like a little bit of audio. Are you?
Yeah, I think that you should give a little context, and then we'll play the trailer.
Well, Reckoning with Torture is made up of 12 documents or excerpts from the War on Terror from pertaining to torture that the ACLU obtained, and then Larry organized them and cut them down. And at Sundance last year, we had several writers, actors, military interrogator, CIA agent read excerpts from read these excerpts, and I wasn't familiar with this stuff until I met these guys, and it's really just altered my mind and my thought process and how I can even just be a citizen anymore. So I think you should just show the trailer, and that would be
Sure.
the best. But I still have a question afterwards. This is our website now. We're putting a website that describes the whole thing, and it will go live soon. But you can play the trailer on the website.
I am reading an excerpt from a declaration of Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Vanderbilt, former lead prosecutor in the military commission case of Guantanamo detainee Mohammed Jawad. The records reflected
112 unexplained moves from cell to cell over a 2-week period. I lack the words to express the heart sickness I experienced when I came to understand the pointless, purely gratuitous mistreatment of Mr. Jawad by my fellow soldiers.
Holding Mr. Jawad for 6 years with no resolution of his case, with no terminus in sight, is something beyond a travesty.
We're reading an excerpted transcript of former CIA Director George Tenet's 60 Minutes appearance in April of 2007.
I'm going to read from the sworn statement of an interpreter at the Kandahar detention facility in Afghanistan.
I was handcuffed, blindfolded, and taken to a building where I was severely beaten.
The detainee was almost unconscious on the floor with a pile of hair next to him. He had apparently been literally pulling his own hair out throughout the night.
The detainee is securely shackled and is deprived of sight and sound through the use of blindfolds, earmuffs, and hoods. The rest of the page is redacted.
America stands against and will not tolerate torture.
You have informed us that you expect these techniques to be used in some sort of escalating fashion, culminating with the waterboard.
This procedure triggers an automatic physiological sensation of drowning that the individual cannot control, even though he may be aware that he is, in fact, not drowning.
They stripped us down naked and they tied our hands behind our backs.
After 37 days without food, I was dragged into an interrogation room where a feeding tube was forced through my nose into my stomach. I was extremely ill.
Lee played the call to prayer with a special alarm clock. Detainee was told, this is no longer the call to prayer. You are not allowed to pray. This is a call to interrogation.
Then the real torturing started.
It was difficult to breathe.
I don't want to ask you about the evidence because you said the evidence was classified. But how can I respond to this? It is not a question and it is not an accusation.
They want answers which you can't give them because you have no involvement in anything.
Detainee became increasingly tired and incoherent. He slept for 1 hour, followed by 1 hour in his chair listening to white noise.
What you're essentially saying is some people need to be tortured.
No, I didn't say that.
You call it in the book enhanced interrogation technique.
Well, that's what we call it.
I mean, that's a euphemism.
I'm not having a semantic debate with you. I'm telling you what I believe.
On another occasion, the AC had been turned off, making the temperature in the unventilated room probably well over 100 degrees.
Anyone ever die in the interrogation program?
No.
You're sure of that?
What, in the program that you and I are discussing? No.
So the idea of the film is, you know, in part we have these well-known people who are you know, reading the documents, and the fact that it's well-known people who are reading the documents makes more people pay attention. But part of the idea of the film is to actually get the public engaged in making the film. And later this month we'll do a rollout. Doug's going to do a rollout where he will ask people to send in footage of themselves reading these documents. And he will incorporate all of that into the final movie. So, you know, it's one of the ways that we're trying to take this message to a broader audience. So, Av, you also had a question.
Yeah. My father was an actor in the 1950s, and he was involved in his union at the time when television was starting to come to popularity. And he was accused of being a communist, and because he was tainted that way, he was thrown out of his union activities. And I'm wondering if you all could comment on the tactical political use of torture in order to intimidate the political discourse, and also, is torture necessary to destroy democracy? You know, is torture sociologically necessary in order to destroy law?
I'll go first because I'm carrying the mic. So torture is used to interrogate, intimidate, and for forced confessions. Those are the main reasons. Those are the main uses of torture in terms of its public use, that is by public officials and their surrogates. And I would say no, actually, with respect to your second question. Torture and democracies have intersected and functioned, not just ours, but there's a seminal book by a colleague of mine, Darius Rejali, called Torture and Democracy, and it documents how the two have interplayed very successfully. They're not incompatible, unfortunately. So.
I agree.
Okay.
Maybe just add one thing about, sort of the other side of the coin around the sort of purpose of torture and what it does. I think you also have to look at the environment that's created to enable torture to happen without great outcry. And I think that what we see is that is maybe more akin to what you're talking about, where, it is the intimidation of if you say anything that would defend the rights of a person who's been labeled a terrorist, then you must be, in line with them. I think even, the Congress of the United States is an example of, it's a pitiful example in some ways, but an example of how, that kind of intimidation politically to speak out led, I think, to some congressional actions or failures to act. I think that citizen, sort of dissent around this issue has been repressed, and I think, the keeping of information from people is all about enabling the objectives of torture to make their way. And I do think that that is destructive of what democracies are supposed to be. So while democracies as well as autocratic regimes both resort to torture, and in a democracy you're supposed to have a lot more tools to defend the rights of people who are being tortured. And what I find particularly confounding about the United States, we work in so many places around the world where, okay, the justice system is corrupt, it's been destroyed through years of war, and you don't have the sophisticated machinery to defend people's rights. Well, here that sophisticated machinery was turned around to make it that much harder to defend people's rights. And I think that's a very scary proposition.
Actually, I would add one thing to that, which it's interesting because I think there is a cost to our democratic institutions for sure, And I think like an interesting example of this is, a group of detainees sued Jeppesen Data Plan, which was the Boeing subsidiary that arranged rendition flights. And when the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they kicked out the case because the government intervened and said it would threaten state secrets to let this case go to trial. But two of the judges, the majority opinion, said, but it's okay. They have alternative remedies. It doesn't have to be the courts. They said, look, the administration, they have all the documents. They can look at it, and if these guys were really abused, they can just go ahead and compensate them. Or Congress, Congress can hold hearings, they can do all these things, and that's an interesting, a very telling moment in the sort of institutional discussion of these issues, because nobody is now saying that these people weren't tortured. The organizational conversation that's happening, the institutional conversation that's happening is just who's responsible for dealing with it. And that's what they're kicking around. So the courts are saying, no, it's the executive branch. The executive branch is saying, no, Congress, that if Congress wanted these people to be able to go to court, all Congress has to do is pass a law that says detainees can sue the government for being tortured, and it just keeps going around in this circle. So, it is interesting. There's nobody who's saying these are bad cases.
Right. There's an interesting sort of parallel between, on one hand, you've got, the lawyers like John Yoo and Jay Bybee say, we didn't authorize anything, we just interpreted the law. And they point to senior officials who authorize things. And Cheney and Addington say, we didn't authorize anything. It was, these people are the ones who carried it out. And they point to the interrogator. So everybody's sort of pointing at somebody else. So you've got that happening on responsibility, and then you've got it happening as well on accountability with Congress and the courts and the executive branch, each trying to pass the buck. So we're running out of time. We have time, I think, for one last question, and then we're going to close up.
Okay. I don't know if what I'm going to say is going to be a summary or lead to a conclusion, but I'm thinking a lot about this question of how democracies now use our democratic processes more to justify torture than to empower the combating of torture and the reinstatement of human rights and the historical ethical standards. And I think that part of the problem has to do with our changing discourse of having to do with, for example, the legal approach to torture has become very mechanized to undermine the sense of the UN Convention Against Torture, for example, with using the reservations, the U.S. reservations against on the convention to call torture not torture. And I'm thinking about there's a language of compassion, human rights, and freedom on the one side, and a language of commodification, utilitarianism, and power on the other side. I'm a psychologist. I've seen that used particularly with the psychologists work within the torture system, where when there were suicides at Guantanamo, the psychologists and psychiatrists said this wasn't a situation of these terrible conditions. These are pre-existing psychological conditions that the detainees brought with them. So suddenly the language of corporate insurance is imposed on how we assess what happens with the experience of the detainees. Similarly, you used in his torture memos the definition of whether it's torture became a definition according to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, where it was only torture if it produced definable symptoms having to do with PTSD. And if you couldn't anticipate the symptoms of torture, that was one of Yu's arguments to prove that it would not be torture. So, and the symptomatology that comes with the diagnostic manual is a move away from medicine as a compassionate art and more as a scientific commodification intervention. I'm particularly concerned about this discourse when we talk about whether torture works, because I think that introduces a utilitarian approach to the question and issue of what we're doing to human beings. And speaking again as a psychologist who studied the role of psychologists in the torture, we could make the case, we should see that torture doesn't work. It gets bad information. It helps create enemies that want to attack us. A psychologist, when you say torture doesn't work, sees a research problem. Sees an opportunity to fund research. And when you fund research because torture doesn't work, the question then becomes, okay, how do we make it work? And my argument here is that we have to be very careful not to fall on the side of the discourse which commodifies these issues, which turns it into a question of utility or power or results, But we have to remain within the ethical, human rights, compassionate discourse of what we've learned, which is that torture is wrong, whether it works or not.
This is definitely not a conclusion. Does anyone want to respond to that?
It might be worth noting the role that psychologists and psychiatrists played in the development of the torture program.
Right.
You wanna,
It's just worth remembering that, you know, the two characters, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, who were the leading sort of paid contractors of the Bush administration, who had the bright idea of taking these, the SEER training program, the resistance training program that we put American troops through who are at risk of being tortured by governments that torture people and don't observe the Geneva Conventions. They were psychologists. They thought that they could take this process of fake torture and torture, which is used specifically during SEER training to get people to make false confessions. That's exactly what the program is for. It's based on this whole regime that was used on American servicemen in the Korean War and in the Vietnam War. There's you know, a lot of CIA documentation about all of these. In fact, what you were saying about torture that doesn't leave marks, there's one of the CIA studies from 1954 talking about the Chinese torture regime, which includes sleep deprivation, isolation, temperature manipulation, diet manipulation. This is the list. And that study says the Chinese are actually very careful not to use physical abuse. The most painful thing they do is use stress positions, make people stand for a long time, because that pits them against themselves, but they don't leave marks, and that's because they have some twisted notion. That's what they said, this is what the study says. They have some twisted ethical notion that somehow is not torture, but we know it's torture. That's what the report concludes. But these two psychologists who were essentially, what their job was working in these training programs, making sure that we didn't mess up servicemen by making this too real. They were just supposed to make sure that we pulled our punches at the right time, you know. They come along and they say, no, we can make this work the way, you know, to get real information. So, you know, it is, you know, there was a very dubious, poisonous route to the psychiatric community that's, you know, that these techniques come from.
I know we're out of time. I just want to make one point, which is that it's morally wrong, yes, but it's also, it's legally unambiguous. And the U.S., if it thinks that it can change the definition of torture in its reservations, this is not allowed. You can't undermine the objective of the treaty through your reservations. But it's unambiguous. Torture is prohibited. It's not about is it effective. It's not about special circumstances. It's just not permitted.
So let me thank once again OSI, 4 Books, PEN American Center, and Cooper Union for hosting. Finally, let me just thank the panelists once more.